Hi, good morning everyone, and we are going into week number 6. This is the 6th week on the class of early church history based on the recording of 4 Gospels. So reading on 4 Gospels is coming soon, but we've been trying to define what the history is and the perspective, historical perspective, which is a key to this class. I mean, you can go into the 4 Gospels and read, but before you do any readings or study on the history, especially church history, it is important to understand and know what the history is and how I mean, it's a very complex field, even though it's very generic field of study. Anyone who is studying in a school, again, whether you're in high school, college, or university, or graduate school, you need to do some study in history, and it is kind of based to any other academic experience. So last week we ended with Martin Luther King's understanding of what the history is. It's not more like a definition, but it is how he conceptualized the need and the importance and the meaning of history. Now we'll continue. Yeah, those famous Malcolm X. Also, this is a black person, and he views, even though he's not a historian, he must have this very keen, deep understanding about history, and this is what he said. You don't need to agree with this, but we'll get some lessons on his understanding and definition. A race of people is like an individual man until it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, expresses its own culture, affirms its own selfhood. It can never fulfill itself. So he basically talks about the function and the role of history for not only for an individual, it's more like a race of people. He's talking about the black people. And history requires to use your own talents. That's how history is produced and made. And take a pride in its own history. So history is something that you need to be proud of, but at the same time, it's something that you regret and reflect on. And also it says, expresses its own culture, affirms its own selfhood. So the history reveals who you are. It kind of identifies who you are, but it never justifies who you are. Some people, unfortunately, used history to justify who they are, what they do. But you can identify who you are by looking at the history. Same for the church. You are trying to identify who you are. Make a reflection and be proud of sometimes and regret sometimes. But history will never justify who you are and what you do. So that's not how you use history. But unfortunately, many times, they use history to justify. To do that, you need to many do this, edit and manipulate history to justify. See, that's what we should not do. History is not to be manipulated or edited. You want to present it as much as possible, even though history involves even though the history may involve, it does involve, not may, it does involve, interpretation. That's, you cannot avoid. But still, it is different. Interpretation, you don't edit, you don't manipulate, you don't twist, or you don't exaggerate. So that's kind of things that you're not trying to do. But many church historians try to do that, and that's not right. Okay? Then Douglas Adams, American. The history of every major galactic civilization tends to pass through three distinct and recognizable phases: those of survival, inquiry, and sophistication. See, that's the three elements that we find there. This is how Douglas Adams viewed the existence. The history of the record of human existence, and it should include survival, inquiry, and sophistication. The primary mode of human existence would be survival. While you are doing survival, human existence does ask questions about the reality. Why? How? And what it is. So that's a question about the reality. That's called inquiry. And then sophistication. This is where the sophistication does occur. When you're trying to answer them, your belief or belief system or paradigm or your perspective is going to say, this is the answer. Or your culture is going to tell you what this answer is supposed to be. And if you are just willingly and passively accept those answers, then you are one of those who are passive recipient or passive participant of the culture. But there are those who are keep asking the question about the belief, the so-called given belief. Well, there's a given reality that you cannot do anything about at the time. And then there's a given belief that you cannot do anything at the time. But later on, as you grow and mature, you're going to ask, is this reality? Can it be changed? Can it be changed? And the church survives. This is one paradigm that you want to remember as you keep doing the church history. Because how you survive as a church in this hostile world. The hostile means, attacking you. Then you ask all these different questions. And the reality is the world and the church is trying to change, reform, and renew and regenerate the world that we live in. That's the main ingredient of the church history. I told you that what the church does, what the church is for, is the key to understanding church history. So that we want to change the reality that is given. And we are trying to change the belief that is given. The world says this and that. The money is important. And then you should look at the people with the different colors, with a different attitude. That's what the word is saying. And the Bible says, no, that's not the way it is. Every person, whether black or white or Asian, they are created in God's image and His likeness. There's no difference. See, that's the challenge. And the history requires that. T.S. Eliot, very famous writer and the thinker, is quoted from according to Prof. Okay. Think now history has many cunning passages, contrived corridors. Corridors are the narrow passage. So, cunning. The key word is cunning, meaning deceiving. It's very tricky. So the history had many tricky passages. It's like like putting a puzzle. Complex, sophisticated. That's what the history is. And issues deceives with whispering ambitions, guides us by vanities. So this is a part of poet, very poetic expression about the history. But it is basically saying history, the existence that you are experiencing may be very deceiving. So the job of a historian, and as a good student of history, you are to avoid this cunning and deceiving influence or beliefs or given beliefs. So that's what the history is about. These are the reference. These are from that website that I. So it's basically what is history. Collection of definitions. So these are the references, and I'm going to give credit to whoever wrote and worked on this material for us to, study. Okay. Now, why do we do history? Okay. That's a very, good question, but also a very difficult question again. As much as it is very difficult to define history. Why do we need to do the history? Why do we need to do the church history? Because it helps. It helps us as a human being for our maturity. It also helps us as a student who are studying and pursuing some academic goals. And it helps us as a believer, a Christian. So any Christian who are genuine, he or she is obligated to do history. It's a mandate. And especially church history, that's a must. Now first, there are many ideas. I got this from also someone else who has already studied the question. You don't have to agree with all of this. I'm just presenting you these lists so you can develop your own thoughts and philosophy about why you do the history. First one, it helps us, doing history helps us to develop a better understanding of the world. See again, unless you know the world, you're not going to be influenced or change the world. And the history is one of the major tools to helping us to understand the world. So that's why we do it. And for us church, it helps us to understand what the church is and how the church is and what it did and what it needs to do. So instead of the word, you can put the church. So develop a better understanding of the church by doing a church history. Number two, it helps us to understand ourselves, who we are, especially for us, who we are, church, Christian. By doing a church history, you have better understanding of yourself as a Christian, as a believer. So that's the second thing. So that too would be enough reason for us to do a church history, right? And the third reason here listed, help us to learn to understand other people. Generally speaking, there are other people. When you say other people, it might be very different from one to another. By doing history, you understand who, as a Korean, when you study your history, your Korean history, you understand also the other people, Chinese, Japanese, who's been interacting many thousand years with Korea. So that's how you understand other people. Sometimes it's It's very narrow, and it gives just one perspective, so-called nationalistic perspective. I mean, every nation does that when they do history. Japan teaches history from their own position and perspective. China does that, and Korea, of course, they do that. But still, it helps us to understand other people. And for Christian, the church history helps us to understand how the world has gone and developed. Number 4, teaches a working understanding of change. That would be the key. As you study church history, church has not been the same. The church in the Middle Age is quite different from church that we know today. Early church is not the same as the church that we see today. But we don't want to go back and just be the same as the early church. That's not possible, because reality is 2,000 years later that we are living in that context. And that reality and context is also the gift from God, or it's a given reality by God. When you deny these reality that are given to you today for 21st century world and the church, then you are denying the authority of God, sovereignty of God. But some of the churches doing that. They try to go back to 2,000 years and then try to imitate exact things of the early church. That's not why we study the early church's history, and that's not right according to the Bible. So some believe it is the right thing to do, but that's not what it is. They do not recognize the change. Change sometimes is negative, but change sometimes very neutral, and change is sometimes very positive. So change is not all bad or all good, but it depends on how you utilize those change. And the history helps you to understand and pinpoint which is good and which is not good for the church and for the world. That's why we do the church history. And doing the history, study of history gives us the tools we need to be decent citizen or decent Christian. And it helps us to make a better decision. That's very important. As you study the church history, as a believer and as a church or church leaders, you're going to make not always the best decision, but at least better decision. Because we are not perfect. Only God makes the best decision. In that sense, we are trying to make a better decision that's very close to what God or Jesus Christ would do in this kind of situation or reality. That's who we are. We're trying to make a better decision, and unless you understand and study the church history, you are not going to be able to do that. As just a general human being, not as a Christian, any human being who does not have perspective on the history, he or she is not able to make a better decision. He or she would have made a better decision if he or she knew the concepts and the lessons of history. That's many times true. So we are studying the history so we can make a better decision. That means when you make a better decision at present, that brings a better future. See, that's how it works. And the next, it helps us, the studying history helps us develop a new level of appreciation for just about everything. So, appreciation. And when you study the history, especially church history, you learn to appreciate the church that are given, or the people who had suffered and committed and sacrificed for the church today. So that studying our past brings that appreciation to you. And that's very important. We need to learn to appreciate the past. Not only criticize the past, but we are obligated to appreciate the past. And only you are able to do that when you study the history. And this list is quoted from Arcadia Publishing. So that's the credential. Now, key. This actually has to do with the perspective, the next lesson, but I'll bring it a little ahead of that next lesson. Whose story? Again, that has to do with the perspective. How do you make that interpretation? Interpretation. Who does the history? That equals to how and what kind of interpretation. Rich and famous? As we know, the history that we know are of those rich and famous. Who owns and exercises the political and socio-cultural power? So those who have power, those who are rich and famous, these are the ones who are being recorded. When we do the history, even the church history or the world history, we cannot do it without record. But we know the history. I mean, those who are able to record, those who utilize the writings, until the recent, only probably 1 to 5% of population were able to read and write. It's the same for the time of Jesus. Only few were able to read and write. Unless, the general public, so-called mass, the 90+% of population had no saying, nothing to say about the world that they lived in. So those narratives are not recorded unless the people who has that power, the rich and famous, decide to write about them. Even if they decide to write them, see the case interpretation, how they view the so-called subject, this general public, just lower, poor people, farmers and laborers and merchants sometimes. They didn't have power. They didn't have saying. So the question, powerful or see, the second category, powerful or oppressed. Who are the powerful ones? They're the ones who wrote and recorded. And the oppressed, even though they were oppressed, if you're the ruler, you're the king, you're the king's people, you're the authority, you're the government, you're not going to say, we have oppressed our people. You're not going to say that. But surprisingly, in the Bible, the story of, as you read the story of Israel, these are the kings, and surprisingly, 2/3 of these kings are bad ones, and the history says they've been bad and very detailed. So that's kind of a surprise. I mean, you want to write a good story about your kings, but usually you know, unless you have a good system of historians. And in China and in Korea, in ancient Korea, ancient China, they had the ones, the historians, who can write whatever they observe, even about the king. And the king would not have anything to influence those. And then they were able to write, not 100% freely, but at least to a certain level of freedom. They were able to write even the bad things about the kings. That's how we have those records in our history, in China and in Korea. For example, Lee Dynasty in Korea, there are many kings, and we do see some records of bad things or evil things that the king has done. But most of the history writes about good things. And the only bad things were written by the ones who were opponent of the power, who overthrew that power, and then that king would write about the previous king, not good but bad, to justify their regime, their actions. So that's kind of, so winner's history, so-called winner's history, is true. Those who wins, and this changes, and the narrative, he or she, usually he, is the one who is going to write the history. So the records that we have, whatever the case, it is the record of those rich and famous and powerful. That's how history has been written until the modern days. Modern days, we have very different way of communication. For example, internet, the social media. These are very different reality than what we had experienced in the past. So, okay, let's take a short break, and I'll come back. Okay. Okay, we are back and let's continue. So, who's writing the story? Whose narrative? Theirs or ours? People write own story. They don't want to write about someone else's story or someone else's perspective. So again, the perspective or the narrative that records that we read many times from the writer's point of view, and the other people, the subject, who are not included in us or I, they are excluded many times. So when you read the history, it is important how they perceive others who are not part of their narrative. So that's one thing, a key to understanding objectivity, meaning how objective is your perspective. Subjective means from your view, your side. Objectivity, more of neutral, from here to there, all different perspectives. That's being objective. So objectivity is one of the key elements when you're trying to see and read the history. Same thing with the church history. But unfortunately, many of this church history is written from the one who has the power, from the leaders. So you need to consider that aspect when you read some of the church history. The key of the debate on history is, are you writing man's history or God's history? And we are. Most of the history written or being written even today are man's history. How we human beings, from our perspective, we are the ones that the main characters of the history rather than God. So that's two very different perspectives. The Christians do, when we do church history, we do acknowledge that God is the author of the history, and He is the main character, and He is the king. And that is quite different perspective than we human beings are the main initiator. We are the major character. We are the ones who make the history. See, that cannot go together. It's either God or man who has that initiative. So whose history are we studying? Are we participating? It is true when you are not a Christian that you are living and running your own history, and you are the center of that history. But once you become a Christian, that perspective has to change. Because you believe in God, God as not only the Savior, but Jesus Christ is the Lord. Lord, He is the authority, He owns you. And the servant, you're not slave, but you're servant. servant and the children of God is to have that obligation to obey the Lord and the Father. So when we say Father God, when Jesus Christ the Lord, that has very great implication in understanding not only your own existence, but about the history of the church and history of the world. So not only the church, but the history of the world. God is the king. He is the authority. He is the sovereign God. That's how we perceive history. So that there is that major difference between Christians and non-Christians. In spite of all these things, the key element is that one. Whose story are we relying on? How we believe the history is becoming. Then people and episode. The whole series of past events connected with someone or something. That someone is people, the human generation. That something is the episode. So you are looking into the evidence of narrative, while we are examining the viewpoint. There's a first person view and second person view and third person view. You can write the narrative and history from these three different perspectives. And then we come to perspectives. So perspective is a key element because it brings your interpretation. And that's how that perspective is belief. Again, that's how you're going to see the history. So there is a certain event and certain people. I mean, they are neutral as possible. Those are facts. But your interpretation and perspective, that's how you write the history. So history is written, whether it's a church history or any other human history. It is written with a perspective. You cannot deny it. Church history, it does involve certain perspective and interpretation. Without it, and it's not going to be history. It's just a list of events. List of events is not history. It's not history again. It's not history. It's just a list of events. And unfortunately, when I was in school, we are taught to just memorize the list of events without really having to learn the implication of those events and people. So, because of that, I had to relearn history, and I assume many of you who are listening to this lecture may have the same problem. So I challenge and urge you to build your perspective, or be able to see the perspective in history. It's not just a list of events and people. Okay? So how do we find about people and episodes? Documentations, and then once you have documentation, then you need to make that interpretation, and as a result of interpretation, then we have something called implication. Implication, it refers to the what does it brings to you, the meaning and the lessons. So any good history, any good study of history will result with implication. If you don't find any implication at all, then you haven't done a good history. So if you're studying history, it's going to result in implication, the lessons, what it means to you. And as we study the church history, the reason that we are doing the church history is to find that implication for you, or your church, or your ministry, whatever that the case might be. And once you find that implication, then there has to be certain application. You put your lesson into the space and time and actions. So you need to do something about, something with the implication, the lesson. So you bring that lesson into your existence, your life. So if you don't bring that lesson into your existence, the way of your life, how you act, how you speak, how you commit, how you spend your time and your money, then there's no application. So unfortunately, many of the majority of the cases are that you find the implication that you learn, you have those lessons, but you don't bring it into real world. It doesn't affect your reality. It just remains as belief. Belief is the idea, the thoughts, and your conviction in your heart. But unless that brings you to the change or application into your reality, the time and space and money and energy and all these things that involved to bring the action, then it doesn't come into existence. So that is very important. You need to apply what you have learned. That's why we do the history. Now this, as we do the history, there's a question. Is a history a science or is it an art? Numa Denis, Fistel de Coulange, yeah, I think that's how you pronounce. I'm not sure, but whatever the name is. It said, history is and should be a science. History is not the accumulation of events of every kind which happened in the past. It is the science of human societies. So this scholar, historian, defined and identifies history as science. So it needs a good science, very logical, rational, based on the facts, and be able to prove. And it has to be very logical. The history involves, according to him, it involves that very logic. And it is about science about the human society and the culture. So, as much as the sociology is science, the history is science, according to this person. And Yale University Press blog. Yale is one of the Ivy League school in the United States of America, and they have their own newspaper, and then this is a blog of the newspaper, and quoted from that. It is a literary rather than scientific endeavor, because the historian is trying to reconstruct why they lived the way they did. Whoever they are, for us it's a church. Okay, how the church lived, why they lived like that. And it's going to be reconstructed again as interpreted. Because of interpretation, as literary, it is a literary, it means it involves interpretation. It's artistic. Interpretation is not part of science. The science only does is present the facts and make a logical and rational arguments based on those facts. But when it becomes a history, it involves belief. The major component of art is about the belief. You know, whether you're drawing a picture, painting, or where you're composing a music or writing a lyrics on a music, it all involves those beliefs. You want to have a message, and then you want to have your own expression of saying these things. That's a key element to art. Art cannot be explained by science. So that's where the art is. In that sense, history is an art. So there is an argument between whether history is an art or science. But I believe, my conviction is it's both. It's neither one or two, one or this or that, but it's both. So it's both science and art. Okay, that does for the lesson. So we try to identify and conceptualize the history and how that would apply to doing church history. Now, lesson 2. It aims at understanding historical perspectives. We talked about the perspectives that involves interpretation. And lesson 2 is going a little deeper to the part of interpretation, trying to understand and how we do the church history. Number one thing to consider when you build a perspective, and this shows how your perspective is formed or created or even influenced. You can just born and have a certain perspective. That's not how it works. As you're born, you learn. You begin to learn. You begin to learn the language. You begin to learn to have feelings. And you begin to learn how to express that feelings by crying. Usually the baby cries because they cannot talk. And even though it sounds like a sane crying for just others, but to mothers, the crying is different from this crying to that crying. So that's how the baby begins to express, to communicate, to learn to communicate. So that's kind of the context that we are given. In other words, it's the reality. So the interpretation or the perspective comes with the given context or given reality that you are in. And for the mature ones, we're not talking about the babies now. We, as an adult, as a student of history, there's a political context. Whether you are living in a democratic society or a religious society, it's like a Muslim world, or a socialistic society like China, North Korea. We have a different political system, and it is, people argue democratic society is better than the sociology or communist society. I mean, that's that's open to the interpretation. So, political context does involve a perspective. Where you grew up, where you're born, where you grew up, how you're taught, what your education is about the political orientation, that does influence your interpretation. And the social is the same. Culture takes the major part in building your perspective, how you interpret the reality, the belief. And the culture is a big thing. I mean, it's very complex, and it's huge, and it's difficult to understand. But many times you're not really aware of this cultural influence, but it is big. And then economical, whether you grew up poor or rich, if you had everything, you have not had the basic things, that would change your perspective, the way you see the reality again. So that influences your perspective. Then, second factor that influences your perspective, or the dimension of perspective. These are the dimensions of perspective. They're intellectual level. So, what your knowledge is, how much knowledge you have, how vast, broad it is, and how deep it is. You can be an expert in certain area of knowledge, while you have nothing on other field, or you have very broad but shallow knowledge base. You know a little bit about everything, but you don't have anything that is, deep. People have different intellectual preference, orientation, or ability. So that will affect your perspective as well. Those who have just elementary education would have a different perspective than those who has a PhD. I'm not saying that those who has a PhD degree would have a better perspective. No, that's not the case. They only have different perspective than those who have not learned as much. Then you would have emotional level or emotional dimension. Some people have more rich emotion than the other, and because of that emotional depth and intensity, it would affect the way you perceive the world and perceive the events and perceive the people. Perception, perspective, the same thing. So your emotional makeups would influence your interpretation of the reality. It's the same for the history. What your emotion says will differentiate the result of your understanding of history. Then spiritual. You may not think the spiritual, invisible dimension, sometimes don't believe, some people believe in, not believe in anything that is spiritual, would it affect and influence the interpretation of history? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And not only it does, I would think that would be the major key component, the element that influence the most about your interpretation, your perspective. So these human dimensions are going to be the key elements also in understanding someone else's perspective about history. Then we have different perspective according to your scholastic orientation. Orientation is the way that your direction is, or your intention is, or your preference is. If your scholastic orientation focuses more on the scientific objectivity, then your view of history more likely based on rather on facts than its interpretation. You just feel safe just to present the list of the things that events happen, and as it is recorded, even though those recordings may include the interpretation in itself, still your job as a historian is to present those recordings and the facts in a manner that it will be very objective. So that would be the one kind of orientation. The other is relativist, subjective. These relativists, they believe nothing is absolute. There is nothing like a truth, or there is nothing that is objective about anything. Especially when you're looking at the history, there's nothing like objectivity. Every history presented so far, even including the records, the documentation, that is subject to interpretation or being influenced by perspectives or interpretation. Thus, everything is subjective about the history. And then there's someone, they're called scholars that called radicals. They are very extreme. And then they usually have tendency to pick the resources that is inclined or helpful to their own claims. That's how I define radicals in this. So the radicals, in that sense, have tendency to edit, sometimes even manipulate the evidences. So that's not really a good way of doing a science. But still, it is a part of our scholastic or academic endeavor. When you're doing an academic work, study in certain fields, especially in history, there are radicals, and they are considered as a part of the community, academic community. So you cannot just say, we don't need you. That's not possible. Even doing a Christian church history, still, we do find these radicals. They do have their things. And even though they go very extreme, as long as the evidence are not manipulated intentionally to deceive others, then we need to take them into account, consider their things. So that's basically the scholastic mind. That's how you do academic work. And we have positivists. These are the people who see the things in a very positive ways. It is good to be positive about life. But when it comes to a field of scholastic endeavor, positivist, they incline to a certain direction. While radicalist goes to extreme, positivist goes to positive only. They only try to present the good things about the church. But the history says history, as you read the history, church has done many things that are even evil, bad, not biblical, or corrupted. So, positivist, you listen to them, you take them into account, but that does not mean that you agree with everything they say. And then we have this political orientation. Every human being, you are political. I mean, I can make that statement safely. Even if a very rural community in a very so-called primitive, I don't like that word, but let's say it for the sake of understanding, so-called primitive, village, remote in Amazon, Brazil, somewhere. In that small village, you're still going to be political. So you cannot avoid being political. And doing history, it's very political thing to do the history. And thus, it does involve that's political, this orientation. Right versus left. radical versus fundamental, conservative versus whatever. So these are kind of, you know, orientation, and then the bipolar direction that goes against one another. That's how the world is, and we do recognize these things. And you are going to position yourself somewhere, whether you like it or not. You're going to position yourself in that seat. So, having to say that, I think we ran out of time, and we'll conclude this 6 weeks class right here. And yeah, glad that you came, and I hope you enjoyed and at least learned something from this lecture. And I'll hope to see you again next week. And have a beautiful and great week, and come back and we'll see you again. Thank you and goodbye.